Right, David.
Yes, right.
Shall we?
Yes, okay.
Okay,
Right.
good afternoon, everybody.
Good afternoon.
He's down to me today, so he has to put up with me. Mike's away for a couple of days. David Salt, he gave the start of this talk last year, so this is part 2. I'm not sure, it's entitled Vocation or Vacation, but I don't know exactly the details. He'll tell us, I'm sure. But anyway, I hope you'll enjoy it because it was really good last year.
I'm sure
All right?
it is. Yeah.
Over
Thank
to you
you.
then, David.
Thank you.
Righto. Well, I've called it vacation or vocation, question mark, because for the first 8 years of my life, with my wife, we went to the Pacific to work for what was then called the Melanesian Mission in what was then the New Hebrides, now named Vanuatu. And then also the bishop asked me to move up to the Solomons and to do further work there. So I'm just going to show you a couple of slides from the last talk that I gave to give you some idea. The picture that you see now is Lolowai Bay on the island of Omba, which is in Vanuatu. And this was where we landed. Like many of the bays in the Pacific, they were originally volcanic craters. And the school that I went to, where my sister was actually the headmistress, was over the hill and down the other side. So I'm just going to show you what the other side looked like. And that was the other side, looking out over to the island of Maiwo. And that was one of the projects that I had to do while I was there. I've never been a builder in my life, but funnily enough, on St. David's Day, the 1st of March, the present Leaf Chapel that we worshipped in was blown down by a hurricane. So it was up to me to see what we could do to have a new chapel. I went over to the hospital, which was nearer to Lolowai Bay, where they had got more permanent buildings. And I just had to look and see how they were built and try and copy them. That, of course, presented problems because all the materials that this chapel were made of had to come up from Australia. Money was tight, so you couldn't over-order, and it was disastrous to under-order. So you had to try and get it just right. And one of the most difficult things was the money, but we were very lucky because a Maori school in New Zealand, with which the school had been in contact, had already saved up some money to give to us. So we managed to scrape the money together to order up the materials to actually create this chapel and all the school around it. But I think I've most probably given another talk on the school. So after we were there, I then moved back to the other side of Lolowai Bay, where I was having to look after what we would call in England readers, but we called them catechists out there. They were people who could read in their own language and in their small villages, because there were lots of small villages, would take prayers morning and evening. And one of the worst jobs I had to do there, which of course I'd never done in my life before, was to install a generator and wire up some of the buildings there. That was one of the worst jobs I had to do because it was under corrugated iron roofs, and with the sun I always waited to the evening and someone had to hold a torch up in there, but that was one of the hottest jobs I ever had to do. So from there we moved to a neighbouring island of Raga, actually named by Captain Cook. He called it Pentecost Island because it was on the Feast of Pentecost, Whit Sunday, that he first observed this island. The people there, and still today, call it Lamalanga. And this is where we made our home. You can see the sandy beach there, and just in there was a little small village. And you can see, like many of the islands, they are quite mountainous. In fact, in Vanuatu, one mountain goes up to over 4,000 feet, and where I went later in the Solomons, going up to over 8,000 feet. So you get these mountainous volcanic islands, and you also get some of these lovely flat palm-waving ones, which we often think the Pacific really looks like. Well, after I stayed here on this island of Raga for just over 2 years, and sadly then the bishop wanted me to move up to the Soloman Islands to take a catechist college for the whole of the diocese. And we were very sad to move this place of Lamalanga here. And funny enough, another odd thing that happened to me here, I became a bank manager because the white missionaries were trying to train up people locally to handle money so that they themselves, if need be, in the future, could order things from Australia. So the Australia-New Zealand Bank were willing to have me setting up this branch. It was very modest because the money that came in was very little, but the people saw that they did earn interest, and in time that they would be given a checkbook and they could make their own orders to Australia. Particularly many of them at that time were interested in getting cameras, and they could send their films off to be processed in Australia. So eventually, and now I move on to really what is part two, we moved on to the Soloman Islands. Good, that's come up. And this is now the island of Guadalcanal, where we settled to run this catechist college. Now, Guadalcanal was very famous from World War II because many sea battles were fought off the coast here, and many ships, both American and Japanese, are still sunk in the waters here. And on the land surface, you can often go into the bush and find ammunition, arms, all sorts of things, which was put there during the war. So everyone who lived there had to be very careful when they went into the bush to get timber or to find food of one sort or another. So we were very lucky there that before we went there, they built us a house to live in. And although a leaf house is much cooler to live in, it was really almost the desire of everyone to have a corrugated iron roof, because you could collect water in a gutter and you could fill up a tank so that you had a supply of water. Because though the rains did come, especially on the Guadalcanal, because that's where the 8,000-foot mountain is, we often got quite a lot of rain, but of course you had to be able to store it. We had 2 children, 2 girls, while we were in Vanuatu, and they moved with us up to the Soloman Islands. And the catechists, the young men who I had in training here, were very kind, who built them a little leaf hut of their own. And it was only, very small, but had a leaf roof, and it was a lovely play hut for them. Here in the next side, that's our daughter at Kohimarama. I think she put some pants on that day, But for most of the time, younger children just ran about naked. And I had two other clergy with me on this station who helped with local languages and so on. And of course their children would come out and play with our children. And there in the front you see lots of pineapples. We grew lots of pineapples. And during the afternoon we taught the catechists in the morning and the evening. During the afternoon they went out to do their gardening, to grow their own food, which might be sort of yam. We had lots of pawpaws, which us Europeans love to have a papaya, pawpaw for breakfast. Funnily enough, the Melanesians felt that pawpaw was baby's food because it was often used as the first food after taking babies off the breast. And so the men thought that was baby's food, and they never touched it. This is a picture of one of the catechists, and it was called St Andrew's College. So I got some badges made in Australia where we had on his badge the St Andrew's Cross. Up the top there was the diocesan badge, and to the left the Cairo sign. On the right-hand side was like to be filled with the sword of the Spirit, and at the bottom sort of like a copy of the Bible, because wherever we went in the islands, they were terribly keen or very proud of their uniforms. So, for example, when we were in Lamalanga, my sister, who was a long-time girl guider, she started girl guides at the school there, and my wife started girl guides on Lamalanga, and before they could be enrolled, they had to make their own uniform. So my wife taught them how to stitch and make a dress and so on, and of course that was an accomplishment. And when I came up here to the Solomons, well, I started Sea Scouts at Lamalanga because we were right by the sea. When I came up to the Solomons, I got these young men as Rover Scouts, so that when they went back to their villages, they could start Cub Scouts or something like that. And as I say, we gave them another badge to take off that one and put on their Scout badge. And they were all very proud of their uniforms. But it wasn't easy teaching these catechists, because the big problem was that a lot of them came here to upgrade their English because they'd been to very basic schools. And of course, unless you could read a book in English, you weren't going to get very far educational-wise. So we tried desperately to teach English, but it wasn't really a complete success because so many of them really should have been taught to read English before they'd left school. So we did have some problems with that, but the other native clergy there, of course, could teach in their own languages, of which, of course, over the whole diocese, there were literally hundreds of different languages, some quite similar to each other. And there was one language which the early missionaries chose in Vanuatu called Mota, which all of them in the early schools learnt that Mota language, so that when the first missionaries started translating their language into prayer books and Bibles and hymn books, they could use at least a Melanesian language. Well, while I was here, we were about 15 miles away from the capital, and that's where the cathedral was for the whole of the diocese. And sadly at that time, an Australian who was the dean of the cathedral left the islands, and there was no one to take over his role as the dean there. So the bishop asked me if I would go there at a weekend to take services in the cathedral. Well, that was all right, except it was a 15-mile walk to go there. So I had to leave, before dark in the morning. And after I'd done that a bit of a time, I said to the bishop, well, this is a bit much. And I was then given his old minibus, which I could then use on a very rough road, sometimes crossing rivers. And of course, if there was a lot of water up, I couldn't get through the river or something like that. But anyway, we tried to balance these two things, but it wasn't easy. But one thing, when I went to the capital, which I found quite interesting, was that, am I getting on to the next slide? The Solomons did have its own broadcasting service, and I was also able to do some very short services over the radio, which went out to the whole of the Soloman Islands. That's what I looked like a few years ago, for I lost all my hair and one thing and another. But of course, for many of the people, they either walked some of these rough roads, which of course were initially put down by the Americans during the war. But just see where we go next. But for most of the people in the islands, their way round the diocese was by boat. And so that's just a small snapshot of where we were in the Soloman Islands. And then, after having been 8 years there, I had a problem. The problem was I was in touch with the theological college, which was on another island, which trained the priests. And we were very keen to put the two establishments together because we felt then we'd have more staff and we'd also have these trainee priests who knew English much better to help other ones who were training to be catechists, and also to get to know them, because in future life they would also most probably meet up together. But I'm afraid the bishop didn't agree with that, so that didn't happen. But then another problem turned up, well, perhaps two other problems. My wife's mother at home, who'd suffered very badly from arthritis and was completely disabled with it. She was in a wheelchair, couldn't do anything on her own, and her husband had to look after her more or less full time. So that was becoming a problem. And the other problem is that while we moved back to the Solomons, we had a son. He's over there now. And of course, up to that time, my wife had been teaching the two girls with a correspondence course from England. And of course, Stephen coming along as another boy, if we stayed too long and we had to start teaching, she had to start teaching him as well, it was going to become a bit of a nightmare to try and cope. But she was a good teacher, because when she came back to England and we took our eldest daughter to a local primary school, they thought her reading was excellent and they were very pleased with her. So sadly, we had to come back to England, and I think I've got or I hope I have. Yes, I'll just show this picture because we arrived back in England in the November of 1962, I think it was 1962, and that was the first day that we were at my parents' home. We had a tremendous hoarfrost. My wife had done these jackets for them before we left the islands. She got up material from Australia, and the girls didn't seem to be terribly worried. But there they are, their first whole day in England. One of the other things which was strange, of course, not having worn many clothes in the islands, it was a terrible nightmare getting them dressed. And when we first arrived in England on the ocean liner, because we came by boat all the way to England in those days, we dressed up our younger daughter, the one in red, and we stood her on the deck of the ship, seeing the ship coming into Southampton. She immediately took off a shoe and threw it over the side because she'd never been used to shoes. That was something quite new. So when we arrived in England, we had to take her barefoot into our local town, which was Reading, looking very odd in the middle of winter, to get her fitted up with another pair of shoes. The next slide I'll just show you is this is in my parents' home, where we had our first Christmas lunch. So on the left is my mother and Margaret, my wife, and then our two daughters there, Christine and Ruth. So after that leave, which was, we had to endure a very tough winter that time, we came back to the Soloman Islands. Oh, sorry, and I've been going a bit back to front. Sorry, I'd sort of gone back in time. My memory's not good at all. So anyway, we came back to England, and the problem then was actually getting a job. Because as a priest being trained overseas, though I did have a degree and a diploma from King's College in London, so I had been trained in this country. But I did manage eventually to get a curacy in North Farnborough at Hawley. So some of you may know Hawley. And the church there was actually linked to a religious community, the Cluer sisters, who their main house was in Oxford. And their chapel was also used as the parish church for the people in North Farnborough. And this is that particular chapel, I think a photo being taken at Easter time with all the flowers. A lovely little chapel, which also on the left-hand side had a side chapel. But we were only there for just under 2 years because the Bishop of Guildford knew that I really ought to be a parish priest by that time. And he said they were desperate to have clergy in the north, go north. So we went up to Bradford Diocese, and there in Bradford Diocese we went to this parish of St Michael and All Angels at Shelf. And Shelf is perhaps sounds a funny name, but it was on a shelf because it was halfway above Bradford. Sorry, my name is failing me. It was above Bradford, going up towards Queensbury, which was a very high, well over 1,000 feet there. And so literally we were on a shelf. And we had a vicarage there, which was an old ironmaster's house in the vicinity. And you can tell how windy it was because in our sitting room, when the wind blew, the carpet blew up from underneath the... So it wasn't exactly one of the warmest places after we'd been to the tropics, as it were. But it was an interesting parish. They were real Yorkshiremen there, and they certainly, called a spade. They weren't... I also had to look after a small home there for what was basically really retired servicemen from World War One who'd really suffered shell shock and things like that. And so they were nearly all almost kind of dementia cases in a way. The only other sort of outstanding thing is that we had a new Church of England primary school built, which was very modern and very up to date. The church put in a kitchen there, so we had a foot in it, although the property, as it were, belonged to the local authority. So we could use the school whenever we wanted to in the evenings for particular things. And we started clubs for children there. And one club we started was trying to link them with the church overseas and with a missionary society. And out of that grew the sense that none of these children, of course, had been to London. And so we arranged a trip taking these school children to London on a coach. So that was then, a good sort of 52 of them. And we had 2 or 3 helpers. I think by today's standards, it would have been quite illegal. We wouldn't have had enough people to look after them, and we'd have had to have carried out this particular thing and that particular thing. But anyway, we took these kids to London. We stayed in a youth hostel in Holland Park, which at that time had the Commonwealth Museum in it, which was an extremely interesting place where every country in the Commonwealth had a particular sort of like stand or stall where they showed their particular place where they lived, what they grew there, what the people looked like, what language they spoke. So spending a day there, you could almost see the whole of the Commonwealth in one day. So that was extremely interesting. We went to places like the Houses of Parliament. We went to Hebrides. We went down on the Thames to take a trip on the Thames. So in 4 or 5 days, we gave them a good go around the capital. And so they really enjoyed themselves. And that was a trip of a lifetime to those children, many of whom had never been out of their own village or locality. Well, then again, we had somewhat the same problems in the north, because at that stage my mother-in-law was really completely handicapped. So we really felt that after 5 years there, we ought to come south again, which we did, and came back then to the parish of Checkendon, just up on the Chilterns, just above to the northwest of Reading, and when you go up on the Chilterns there. And here you see that church in the winter, and that was the initial, thinking it was a vocation of a vocation, and you saw the winter and the summer. So again, it was up a bit, so we had some quite heavy winters there. The house we lived in, the rectory, was a very old house which had been there, I think since, certainly the early 18th century. No, before that, sorry. It had been a Tudor house going way, way back, and a lot of these bricks on the right-hand side were Tudor bricks, so we knew that it had been a Tudor house. Then on the left-hand side, it was added to by the Victorians and made into really quite a massive rectory. And so we moved there, but at that time, the diocese then hived off the right-hand side bit and made it into a separate dwelling. So we had a neighbour who moved into that part, and we lived in the part on the left-hand side. We had great big rooms there, but with this living, it's called, the living at Checkendon. We also had some woodland and pasture, because, I mean, in previous years, the priest might have done it himself or employed someone to have his own cow and cattle and gardens and woodland. So we were able to get plenty of wood from our woods to light up huge, great fires, had a massive open fireplace. Luckily in the kitchen an aga had been put in, and that was a godsend, because most of the time in the winter we tended to almost sort of like live in the kitchen. It was a very interesting parish, and one of the interesting things of that part of the world, I'm trying to keep an eye on the time. Is it?
It's only, you've only been going half an hour. Fine.
Was that all the parishes there were linked to the River Thames, so that each parish had a strip down to the Thames. They had water from the Thames, they had pasture, and then they had woodland. And some of these parishes have been chopped off, so they just remained on the by the Thames, or they still were linked. And one parish was becoming vacant, where the vicar had his church down by the Thames, and another small church up to a little village called Woodcote. And when he retired, I was on the committee in Oxford Diocese that oversaw rectories and one thing and the livings. I suggested that that parish of Woodcote ought to be a parish on its own. And, it deserved a priest on its own, because it was being developed as a big village. When I went to the parsonages board, who looked after the parsonages, they said, "You must be joking. Where do you get the money from?" They said, "You can't just make another parish like that." The only answer I found was to put all the parishes together in a group ministry, and if we did that in a group ministry, we could use the money that belonged to that from that parish to give them a house there. So that's what we did. I mean, a most odd thing in the Church of England, and of course, to have a new group ministry, you had to have an order in council signed by the Queen. That's the way legally it sort of all happened. So I managed to get another team vicar who came over to that parish of Woodcote. He's here on the right-hand side of the picture, and you'll see me in the middle there. And this was on a day when Woodcote Parish were very keen on steamrollers, and every year they held a particular weekend for people coming to admire steamrollers. And so one time when we were in the team ministry, we got the steamrollers to start at Checkendon and go all their way to Woodcote. And then one of the other things which I was able to do when we were in Checkendon was actually to go overseas and do an exchange with an American priest. And I have talked of this elsewhere. And that's the parish in Colorado that we did an exchange with. And it also happened that nearby distant cousins of my wife also lived there, so we were actually able to see them. But we were very lucky there because we had both trips in people who owned helicopters and planes taking us all over the place and having a wonderful time there with wonderful people there. But after that, and after having been at Checkendon for 11 years, I felt perhaps it was time to have a move. So we then moved to the parish of Hungerford, St Lawrence Hungerford, which was right by the side of the Kennet Canal. We had a lovely time there. I also had charge of another church at a place called Newtown near to Hungerford. That was an interesting history because when they had the plague, the people who were fit and to get away from the plague moved further north to a place they called Newtown, but it was still linked to the actual parish of Hungerford. One of our times there, we were also, through one of the church wardens at Hungerford, linked to a parish in Sweden. So we had two adventures where we went over to this, took a coach load to this parish of Sweden. And here we are with the, again on the right-hand side, the Swedish priest who's part there of the Lutheran Church. So they weren't just what I call evangelical, they would still wear robes and so on. I took my robes with me. We took our parish banner, and this was the one of our church wardens there who organised the whole trip for us. And so that was one particular adventure that we did. But then, of course, when I was at Hungerford, we had the terrible problem of the Hungerford tragedy, when one particular individual, towards the end of August, just trying to remember his name, a chap called Michael Ryan, who belonged to a local gun club, just ran amok, and he killed 16 people in the town and wounded 16 others. And I'm sure most of you will remember that particular event. It had wide publicity because nothing like that had happened before in England to that sort of extent. And because it happened at the end of August, Parliament wasn't sitting, and so it provided, major news coverage for much of the time. And of course it became a very busy time for me, both in trying to see those who were wounded, taking funerals for those who died, and most mornings being picked up at about 4 o'clock by a taxi, taken up to London to either the BBC or one of the other broadcasting companies, either to reflect on what was happening in Hungerford, or they would quiz me on the day's news, because they always gave me a whole set of newspapers to look at on the way up to London. And though that was a bit of a chore in a way, I did feel that getting out of the parish at that particular time, just for a brief thing, was good for me in a sense. It was a bit of a game changer. One of the things I didn't look forward to was going to visit the wounded who were in the hospital at Swindon. But it was so funny when I got there, because they were all in the same ward, they were as cheerful as could be, because they were all with people that they knew, and so that made all the difference to them, being in their community. And of course, that's what mattered to the people back in Hungerford. It made them link up much, much more with their community. And we tried to do things, arranging things at the church where people could come and we could talk and we could share all sorts of problems. Well, when the tragedy had more or less run its course after a month or so, I was very lucky in being able to get a local firm who organised events for people to actually bring in the chairs and arrange a stage and everything, so we could have a town service for the whole community, at which the Archbishop of Canterbury came. He did the sermon. He was extremely good in talking with the victims, those who'd lost people there. I always give him full marks for that. And the Queen was invited to come, but she sent her representative. So when he came, he acted as the Queen and had to be received as the Queen. And by a quirk, I actually knew him because, if you remember right back to my last thing, my father was a grocer in the village of Mortimer below Reading, and the Honourable Gordon Palmer, as was his name, was one of his customers. So my father knew him and I knew who he was. And so he called us up to London because we were also invited to a garden party there. And he said, now when you get to the palace, he said, say that who you are and you're coming to see me. So when we arrived at Buckingham Palace, we stopped by the gate and they wondered who we were, and we went straight in, whereas everyone else was looking, say, who are they, you know? And all the gentry who came in their morning dress and had to park, you know, elsewhere were not allowed in with their Rolls Royces and the like. So that was an interesting experience. The other thing that I always love is that Honourable Gordon Palmer, he was the Queen's Chamberlain at that time. He said, now, whatever you do, he said, you're going to be presented to the Queen just with one or two other people. And we went up there with the Mayor of Hungerford as well. He came with us, with his wife and daughter. They came up, and my wife came up. And he said, now, whatever you do, the Queen only shakes hands with a few people before she then goes off to her pavilion with the diplomatic corps. So he said, whatever you do, you've got to get through to the front row where the Queen comes through. Well, of course, I was up there. Yeah, I did have a jacket on, but I was just in my ordinary dog collar. And we started to try and push our way through. And I remember several indignant people saying, who do they think they are? Who do they think they are? You know. But I knew that's where we got to go, and so we pushed our way through. And here now you'll see the final evening when we held in the middle of the town this service for the whole of the community, which really was quite a success. Perhaps I was a bit out of turn there, but I'll just show you, this is us lot when we went up to see the Queen for a garden party. Perhaps one of the only other significant things at Hungerford while we were there, because we were beginning to reorder the church and to put in choir stalls, because we had a lady who was a very good pianist and organist who was willing to start a choir. And my son, who at that time was a cabinet maker, he came to Hungerford to actually remake and set up the pews for the choir. And at the back end of the church, we used a sort of an empty room to make a small kitchen where after the service we could serve coffee and tea and that sort of thing. But in turning out this old cupboard at the back of the church, I found an old Bible. And when I looked at it, it was one right from 1662, a real old King James Bible. And I thought, well, this must be worth a fortune. So I went to a local bookseller and I said, now, what are these worth? He said, I don't want to disappoint you, but because people always keep their Bibles, there are plenty of them around. So it's not so old as you think. But it was all in tatters. And I'm very glad to say, again, in Hungerford, there was a very good man who lived on the outskirts of the village, who was a very good bookbinder. So he rebound the whole Bible, and I don't know, I think maybe even we put it on an old book stand so that people could actually see this old Bible. And it's one that was called the Breeches Bible, because when God made clothes for Adam and Eve, it says in there, and he gave them breeches to put on, which was a sort of a rather unique translation of the Hebrew words there. So you see me there looking at that Bible, pointing to that in the book of Genesis. Well, then my time at Hungerford came to an end because back near Henley-on-Thames, there was a man who'd been out to Melanesia, a retired missionary, who took on to be the secretary of the Melanesian Mission in this particular country. He retired to move on to another parish, and there was no one else to take over the job. And my sister, who by that time, after 23 years of service in Vanuatu, she retired and said, well, if you don't do the job, I can't think there's anyone else who knows anything about the islands to do that job. So we then went to the parish of Harpston, very near to Henley-on-Thames, and I was also the secretary for the Melanesian Mission there, and also the parish priest here. So some Sundays I was away talking about the mission in parishes all over the country, and other times there was perhaps a retired priest from Henley who'd come in and take the services. We had a very happy time there. We did. Oh, sorry, I'm going back a bit in time now. I'm getting all the logic wrong because I don't know why I've got it here. But while we were at Checkendon, have a look at this picture. That's me as Sweeney Todd, the demon barber of Fleet Street. Because in the parish at Checkendon we had a chap from the BBC, and he was trained in drama, and so he got us in the parish to do one or two plays, and I thought you might like to see. This is the sort of job that sometimes vicars get cajoled into doing. So here is that demon barber of Fleet Street. But also, when we then moved to the parish of Harpston, this one here that I showed, the Archbishop declared what he called a decade of evangelism, when the churches ought to be getting new members, evangelizing. So at that time, I got together the other members of the churches in and around Henley, that's Roman Catholic, Presbyterian, Baptist and so on. We met together, the ministers met together. What can we do together jointly? So we thought perhaps one of the good things that we might be able to do, which we'd also pioneered at Harpston, was to do like nativity plays. So we did a nativity play at Harpston in the local secondary school at Christmas time, when we invited all the children from the school and others to come. And then when we were meeting with the other clergy, I thought, why can't we do something in the whole of Henley? So we then actually got to do plays of the life of Christ in the theatre at Henley. And this is just a snapshot from one of them, and it shows you how we had some very clever people, where in the theatre, by putting down a whole lot of plastic with blue underneath, you could create like a scene like Christ stilling the waters on the Sea of Galilee. So we had some very clever people there. We did other plays, also doing Christ's ministry and also going into the resurrection and so on. So after a while, of course, we're going near the end. We then left there. We first retired to a clergy home. Then we found ourselves on Hayling Island, where we were very happy and went to the parish church there of Hayling, and because there was a vacancy there, I helped with other retired clergy, and there was another church there at Northney on the island where I helped there as well. That was interesting because one Remembrance Sunday, the people in that church had made all these handmade commemoration poppies for the people there. And I'll rush on pretty quick now to get to the end, because we had to come back up there because my wife was getting dementia. And so we came to Furwood Court at Checkendon, which some of you will know, and I think make this the last picture. That was basically us just before we retired there, and this is where we now live at Furwood Court. So that basically is the second part of our adventure in our lives. So I hope it was of interest and not too boring.
Some adventurer. Like some of us, we don't get anything like that in our lifetime, I think. But thank you, David. And it was very interesting about the Hungerford side, because I do remember you in the news and that. As soon as that picture came up, I thought, right, fine, now I know.
Yes.
Anyway, thank you again.
It's okay.
Yes, I'm very quite amazed at the number of challenges you've had.
Yes, yeah.
And your ability to cope with those and achieve.
Try, yeah.
But equally, well, they're so different. They're not similar challenges. You go from being a hut maker to being, well, quite a considerable mason at one side. So yes, an amazing talk and an amazing life. I'm sure we all thank you for sharing that with us. Very good.
Okay.
May come back for another talk on something different. But it's been really good. Before you, I haven't switched the lights on because we seem to have a lot of light. So next talk is Shetland wildlife.
Okay.
And it's by Norman Horsham. It's his talk, but he's not with us any longer. So PP Mike Hillman, he will be presenting it, and so that would be an amazing achievement for this club as well. So that's next week, 13th February, and at the bottom I've got the next 4 talks. So they'll be posted. Well, Michael will be posting all these talks as usual, but this will be posted on the front door, and you'll be able to check that with that. Anyway, thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Okay.
Sorry, I can't continue. All right.